When English settlers first landed in Virginia in 1607, life was incredibly hard. They faced starvation, disease, and attacks from Native Americans. Survival was everything. To keep order, they needed strict rules. The Church of England was the official religion. It was not just a suggestion, it was the law. The Virginia Company, which set up the colony, saw the church as vital. It brought structure, it offered moral guidance, it connected them to England and its ways. They believed God's favor was important for the colony to succeed. If people did not follow God's rules, bad things might happen. This belief shaped the earliest laws. These early laws were very tough. They are often called laws divine, moral, and martial. Sir Thomas Dale brought them over in 1610. These laws were basically a military code. Jamestown was like a military outpost. Everyone had a role, everyone had to follow orders. This included religious duties. These laws made church attendance mandatory. You had to go to church. You had to go twice a day, every day. You also had to go to sermons on Sunday. Missing church was a serious offense. The penalties were harsh. The first time you missed, you lost your allowance of food. The second time, you were whipped. The third time, you faced much worse. Sometimes it was death. Imagine being in Jamestown in those early years. You are fighting to survive. You are probably hungry. You are tired, but you still have to go to church. If you skipped, it was seen as a threat to the whole community. It was not just a personal choice, it was a breach of public order. It was like deserting your post. The laws covered more than just attendance. They made it illegal to speak badly about God. You could not curse. You could not speak badly about the Christian faith. You could not disrespect ministers. Doing any of these things could lead to severe punishment. Fines, whippings, even death were possibilities. Why were they so extreme? The colonists were trying to build a new society from scratch. They were far from home. They felt vulnerable. They needed strong social control. And religion was a key tool for this. It gave people a common purpose. It created a sense of community. It enforced moral behavior. The government and the church were not separate. They were two sides of the same coin. The governor had authority over civil matters, but he also had power in church affairs. Ministers were not just spiritual guides, they were also important figures in keeping order. They reported on people who did not follow the rules. These rules were not just on paper. They were enforced, people were punished, records show cases of individuals being disciplined for various offenses. This included not going to church. It showed the government was serious. They would not tolerate dissent. They would not tolerate laxity in religious observance. Life in early Virginia was not about personal freedom. It was about survival of the group. Individual beliefs came second to the needs of the colony. The church was part of the machinery of survival. It was a powerful force. It demanded conformity. It did not offer choices. You were part of the system, or you faced the consequences. The threat of being arrested, or worse, for not attending church was real. It was a foundation of the colony's first few decades. It was a time of absolute power. The rules were clear: follow them or pay a heavy price. This strictness would change over time, but it set a precedent. It showed how important the established church was to the early leaders. They wanted to create a godly society. They wanted to avoid the chaos they feared. Church attendance was a visible sign of obedience. It was a public declaration of loyalty. It was a way to keep everyone in line. This system worked in its own harsh way to help the colony survive its first difficult years. But it came at a cost to individual liberty. As Virginia grew, things changed a bit. The colony was still tough, but it was no longer just about bare survival every single day. Jamestown became more stable, more people came, towns started to form, the laws about church attendance remained. But how they were enforced shifted. The Church of England was still the official church. It was established by law. This meant it got tax money, it had legal power, everyone in Virginia was expected to support it. This included going to its services. The main governing body for the local church was the vestry. Each parish had one. Vestrymen were important local figures. They were usually wealthy landowners. They managed church property, they hired ministers, they set parish boundaries, and they also had a role in enforcing moral laws. This included making sure people went to church. Laws from the 1630s and later still said you had to go to church. If you missed, you could face fines. The fine was often 50 pounds of tobacco. Tobacco was the colony's money. It was a significant amount for many people. This was not a small penalty. Church wardens were the people who reported violations. Every parish had them. They were like local religious police. They watched who attended services. They also kept an eye on general moral behavior. They reported people to the county court. The court would then fine or punish people. This system meant local people were watching other local people. It was hard to hide if you weren't showing up. The community knew, your neighbors knew. The church wardens knew. But enforcing these laws was not always easy. Virginia was a big place. People lived far apart. Roads were bad, or often just trails. Getting to church could be a journey. Some people lived too far from a church to attend regularly. The law did make some allowances for this. If you lived too far, you might not be fined, but the distance had to be truly great. Sabbath observance was also a big deal. The laws said Sunday was a holy day. You could not do unnecessary labor. You could not travel. You could not engage in recreation. You had to attend church. These laws were meant to keep Sunday special. They also ensured people were available for services. Fines for breaking Sabbath rules were also common. For example, laws in the late 17th century punished those who traveled on Sunday, or those who did not go to church for 3 Sundays in a row. The fines could add up. The court records from Colonial Virginia show this. People were brought before the justices. They were accused of not going to church, or for working on Sunday, or for other Sabbath-breaking offenses. The courts handled these cases. They issued fines. Sometimes they ordered other punishments. Ministers were also responsible. They were supposed to preach twice on Sunday. They were to hold services on holy days. They were also supposed to lead moral lives. They had a role in informing the vestry and courts about people who were not following the rules. Over time, the penalties became less severe than Dale's Code. Death for missing church was long gone. But fines were still common, and the social pressure was strong. Not attending church meant you were an outsider. It could affect your standing in the community. It could impact your ability to trade or do business. The establishment of the church meant that all taxpayers, regardless of their personal beliefs, paid taxes to support the Anglican Church. This was a source of tension later on, but for most of the 17th century and early 18th century, it was the norm. People expected it. It was part of being a Virginian. So, could you be arrested? Yes, but it evolved. In the earliest days, absolutely, with severe consequences. Later, it was more likely to be a fine from the local court. You would be called before a justice of the peace. You would be told to pay. If you refused to pay, then yes, you could be imprisoned. That is a form of arrest. So the threat was still there. It just shifted from immediate physical punishment to a legal process involving fines. The system aimed for conformity. It wanted a stable society. The Anglican Church was the backbone of that society. Going to church was a public act. It showed you accepted the social order. It showed you were a good, law-abiding citizen. Not going to question that order. And the authorities were quick to put down anything that questioned their authority. Things got more complicated as time went on. Virginia was not just for Anglicans anymore. People with different religious beliefs started coming, or people already there started converting to new faiths. These new groups were called dissenters or nonconformists. They did not follow the Church of England. The main dissenting groups were Quakers, Presbyterians, and later Baptists. Each faced their own set of challenges. And their presence made the old laws about church attendance harder to enforce. Quakers were among the first. They arrived in the mid-1600s. Quakers were different. They did not have ministers in the same way. They believed in an inner light in everyone. They refused to swear oaths. This was a big problem for colonial governments. And oaths were central to legal proceedings and loyalty pledges. They also held their own meetings. They would not attend Anglican services. Virginia responded harshly to Quakers. Laws were passed specifically against them. They were fined heavily for not attending Anglican church. They were fined for holding their own meetings. Quaker ministers who traveled through Virginia faced imprisonment. They were whipped. Their property was seized. People who helped Quakers were also punished. The government saw them as a direct threat to the established order. Their refusal to conform was seen as rebellious. Presbyterians started growing in number in the early 1700s. Many came from Scotland or Ireland. They settled in the Shenandoah Valley. They were a bit different from Quakers. They had ministers, they believed in predestination, they were often more organized. The government saw Presbyterians as less of a threat than Quakers, but they still had to be careful. The Toleration Act of 1689, passed in England, allowed some nonconformist worship. But it had conditions. Dissenting ministers had to get a license to preach, their meeting houses had to be registered, and they still had to pay taxes to support the Anglican Church. So, a Presbyterian might not be arrested for not attending Anglican Church. But they could be arrested if their minister was preaching without a license, or if their meeting house was not registered. or if they openly criticized the established church. The goal was to control them, not necessarily to crush them completely. As long as they played by some rules, they could exist. Then came the Baptists. They really shook things up. The Great Awakening in the mid-1700s brought a wave of religious revival. Baptists grew very fast. They were passionate. They preached to common people. They often met in homes or fields. Their services were emotional. They preached conversion. The Anglican establishment saw Baptists as a major problem. Baptist ministers often preached without licenses. They challenged the authority of the Anglican Church directly. They criticized its formality. They often preached against the rich and powerful. This felt like a challenge to the entire social structure of Virginia. Many Baptist ministers were arrested. They were charged with disturbing the peace. They were charged with preaching without a license. They were put in jail. They faced public harassment. Mobs sometimes broke up their meetings. They were seen as fanatics. Their growing numbers were alarming to the colonial leaders. So, in this period, the question, could you be arrested for not attending church, gets more specific. It was often not just for not attending any church. It was for not attending the Anglican Church A&D, attending a dissenting church that was not properly licensed or approved. Or for preaching without a license if you were a dissenter. The laws were used to control the spread of these new religions. The goal was to keep the Anglican Church supreme. The government believed that a uniform religion meant a stable society. Too many different religions, they thought, would lead to chaos. This period saw a lot of arrests and punishments for religious reasons. These were not always direct arrests for simply missing a Sunday service. They were often arrests of ministers. They were arrests of people who hosted illegal meetings. They were arrests of people who actively promoted these unapproved faiths. The resistance from these dissenting groups was important. They kept pushing for their right to worship freely. Their struggles laid the groundwork for the bigger fight for religious freedom. They showed that many people would rather face jail or fines than give up their beliefs. This struggle was a major part of Virginia's history leading up to the American Revolution. The harsh treatment of dissenters caused a lot of unrest. By the mid-1700s, Virginia had a large and growing population of non-Anglicans. Baptists, Presbyterians, and Quakers were not going away. Many felt it was unfair. They had to pay taxes to support a church they did not believe in. They also felt it was wrong to be arrested or harassed for their worship. This situation started to change minds. Even some Anglicans began to question the old system. They saw the injustice. They saw that persecuting people for their faith was not working. It was creating division. Key figures emerged who championed religious freedom. Two of the most important were James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Both were Virginians, both were Anglicans by background, but they believed strongly in the separation of church and state. Jefferson was a big thinker. He believed that government should not interfere with a person's conscience. He saw forced religious conformity as a form of tyranny. He famously wrote about a wall of separation between church and state. He wanted people to be free to believe what they wanted, or to not believe at all. And Madison was a shrewd politician. He understood how to get things done. He saw the political power of the dissenting groups. He knew their support would be crucial for the revolutionary cause. He also genuinely believed in religious liberty. During the American Revolution, the cause of religious freedom gained momentum. The colonists were fighting for liberty from British rule. It seemed hypocritical to deny religious liberty to their own citizens. Many dissenters actively supported the revolution. They saw it as a chance to gain their own freedom. Petitions poured into the House of Burgesses, Virginia's colonial legislature. These petitions came from Baptists, Presbyterians, and other groups. They asked for an end to the established church. They asked for an end to religious persecution. They demanded the right to worship as they pleased. They wanted to stop paying taxes to the Anglican Church. In 1776, Virginia passed the Virginia Declaration of Rights. This was a hugely important document. It stated, that religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience. This was a big step. It declared the principle of religious freedom. It meant the government could not force people to worship in a certain way. But it did not immediately disestablish the Anglican Church. It was a declaration of intent. It would take more time and effort to put it fully into law. The process of disestablishment was slow. It faced strong opposition from those who wanted the Anglican Church to remain the official religion. They argued it was necessary for moral order. They feared chaos if the church lost its privileged status. But Madison and Jefferson kept pushing. In 1779, Jefferson drafted the bill for establishing religious freedom. It was radical for its time. It declared that no one should be compelled to attend or support any religious worship. It said that a person's civil rights should not be affected by their religious opinions. It took years for this bill to pass. It faced many debates. Madison eventually guided it through the Virginia legislature. It finally became law in 1786. This was a landmark moment. It fully separated the church and state in Virginia. It ended all government support for the Anglican Church. It guaranteed full religious freedom for everyone. Once this law passed, the old laws about church attendance were gone. There was no longer an official church to attend. There were no longer fines for not showing up. There were no longer arrests for preaching without a license. Virginia became a model for other states. It influenced the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The First Amendment has similar protections for religious liberty, so the answer to being arrested for not attending church changed dramatically in this period. The laws that allowed it were slowly dismantled. The fight for freedom of conscience won out. It was a long, hard struggle, but it reshaped the legal and social landscape of Virginia forever. It created a society where religious belief was a personal choice, not a government command. So, could you be arrested for not attending church in Colonial Virginia? The simple answer is yes, at times. But it is not a simple yes or no. The full answer is much more complex. It changed a lot over the nearly 2 centuries Virginia was a colony. In the very early days, absolutely yes. From 1607, and especially with laws like Dale's Code around 1610, not attending church was a serious crime. It could lead to loss of food, whippings, or even death. The colony was fighting for survival. Religious conformity was seen as vital for order and divine favor. The church and state were one. There was no room for individual choice in religious matters. As the colony grew and became more stable, the strictness eased somewhat. By the mid-17th century and into the 18th century, the punishment for simply missing Anglican church services usually became a fine. This fine was often for a set amount of tobacco. If you refused to pay the fine, then yes, you could be arrested and put in jail. So, the threat of physical restraint was still there, but it came through the legal system of fines and non-payment. Church wardens would report you. Local courts would handle your case. Then new religious groups started to appear. Quakers, Presbyterians, and especially Baptists. These groups did not attend the Anglican Church. They held their own services. The authorities saw this as a challenge. It was no longer just about not attending the Anglican Church. It became about attending the wrong church or preaching without permission. Many dissenting ministers were arrested and jailed. They were charged with disturbing the peace. They were charged with preaching without a license. Their followers also faced fines and harassment. So, during this period, you could certainly be arrested for your religious activities, even if it was not directly for not attending the Anglican Church. It was often for actively practicing a different faith in a way the state deemed illegal. This persecution fueled a powerful movement for religious freedom. Figures like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison led this fight in Virginia. They believed that government should not force religious belief. They pushed for the separation of church and state. This fight gained strength during the American Revolution. Dissenters joined the cause of liberty. They demanded their own freedom to worship. In 1776, Virginia declared the principle of religious liberty. Then, in 1786, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom became law. This law ended the official status of the Anglican Church. It guaranteed that no one had to support a church they did not believe in. It said people could not be punished for their religious beliefs. Once this law passed, the old rules were gone. You could no longer be arrested or fined for not attending church. Religious belief and worship became a matter of personal choice. The government had no say in it. So the answer depends on when you ask the question in colonial Virginia. Early 17th century, yes, very likely, with severe consequences. The journey from forced attendance to full religious freedom was a long one. It was full of struggles, arrests, fines, and debates. But it profoundly shaped American ideas about individual liberty. Virginia's experience became a model for the rest of the nation. It showed that a society could thrive without an established church. It proved that religious belief could be a deeply personal matter, protected from government interference. The echoes of this fight are still felt in the United States today. The freedom to choose, or not choose, a religion is a core part of what it means to be American. This all started with the tough rules in early Virginia and the brave people who fought against them.